The night Elizabeth Voss was sent to ruin, she wore her sister's pearls, not her own. She had none left. Her mother had sold them 3 weeks prior to cover the first wave of debts Cecily's scandal had left behind. Quietly, without asking, the way the Voss family did most things to Elizabeth, without asking. The pearls were borrowed, the gown was altered, and the carriage was borrowed too, from a neighbor who pitied them enough not to say so aloud. Elizabeth sat in it alone, her gloved hands folded in her lap, watching the dark countryside blur past the window. She understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has already grieved a thing, that she was not being sent to the Hartwell ball as a guest. She was being sent as a message, a sacrifice, dressed up in ivory silk and her sister's jewelry, dispatched to deliver an apology that was not hers to give, for a disgrace that was not hers to own. Cecily, of course, was at home. Cecily, of course, was at home. Cecily, of course, was at home. The Hartwell estate blazed against the October sky like something from a fever dream. Every window was lit, the drive lined with torches that reflected gold against the wet cobblestones. Elizabeth descended from the carriage without assistance. The footman did not offer his hand. She noticed. She said nothing. She had become practiced at noticing things and saying nothing. It was, she had discovered, the primary skill required of a woman in her position being this, the second daughter of the Earl of Voss. The plain one, the sensible one, the one society had always looked past on its way to admiring Cecily. And now, in the wreckage of Cecily's very public, very catastrophic broken engagement to Lord Ashby's eldest son, Elizabeth had been handed a new position entirely. She was the family's apology. She was the face they sent when they were too ashamed to send their own. The Duke of Mercer stood across the ballroom, his expression calm yet unreadable. His younger brother had been quietly but devastatingly drawn into the very scandal that had consumed the Voss family. Though the Mercers had committed no wrongdoing, their name had been dragged into disgrace because Cecily, cornered and desperate, had sacrificed the Duke's brother's reputation in a desperate attempt to lessen the consequences of her own mistakes. Elizabeth had learned the truth only an hour earlier. The discovery came through a letter she had never been meant to see, carelessly left open on her father's desk. It was written by the Duke's father, formal, restrained, and painfully precise. Every sentence carried the weight of accusation, demanding that the Voss family acknowledge the damage they had allowed to be done to the Mercer name. She had told no one. She had not informed her mother. She had not ordered the carriage to turn back. Instead, she had done what she always did when faced with unbearable truths. She sat quietly with the knowledge, alone in the darkness, until she could breathe through it. Then she made a decision her mother would never have approved. She would not repeat the 3 carefully rehearsed sentences her mother had insisted she deliver. She would do something far more dangerous. She would tell the truth. The ballroom seemed to swallow her whole. 200 candles bathed the grand hall in warm light, while more than 300 guests filled the air with the constant murmur of aristocratic conversation, a sound that had always reminded Elizabeth of water rushing over stone. As her name was announced, heads turned, not with curiosity, with judgment. The whispers reached her before she had taken more than a few steps. The Voss girl, the other one. She kept her chin high and continued forward. At the far end of the room, near the tall windows overlooking the moonlit garden, she saw him for the first time that evening. She recognized the Duke of Mercer the way one recognizes an approaching storm, not because of any single feature, but because of the unmistakable stillness surrounding him. He observed the room with quiet, effortless composure, the gaze of a man who had no need to pretend interest because nothing escaped his notice. Then, in a ballroom where everyone else seemed determined to look through her, his eyes found hers. He did not look away. Elizabeth had no idea what he saw in that moment. She could not yet know that the single glance they shared would change both of their lives forever. Elizabeth felt an inexplicable chill settle over her. Deep down, she knew the evening was about to take a turn she had never anticipated. In her estimation, she had no more than 4 minutes before someone chose to make her the evening's target. It was the kind of certainty she had developed over years of observing the hidden rules that governed social gatherings. She had learned to read a room instinctively, the subtle patterns of who stood beside whom, which smiles concealed hostility, and which whispered remarks sent ripples through the crowd. Lady Hartwell, lingering near the fireplace, had interrupted her conversation just long enough to watch Elizabeth cross the ballroom. Lady Ashby remained stationed near the refreshment table, lazily waving her fan with the measured confidence of someone preparing to deliver a devastating remark. Across the room, a cluster of younger women waited in silence, watching carefully before deciding which side to join. Elizabeth continued forward without hesitation. She had come with a purpose. She found Edward Ashby standing near the entrance to the card room, engaged in conversation with 2 gentlemen she did not recognize. He looked slimmer than she remembered, and his face carried a carefully practiced expression of calm detachment. She recognized it immediately, the look of a man who had spent years concealing every emotion to prevent others from reading his thoughts. She waited quietly until good manners compelled him to acknowledge her presence. When he turned, something flickered in his eyes before disappearing almost instantly. "Miss Voss," he said. "Mr. Ashby," Elizabeth replied. Her voice remained steady, free of the polished politeness expected on such occasions. "I owe you an apology, but not the one my mother prepared for me. I left that speech behind in the carriage. What I wish to offer is my own." She met his gaze without wavering. "I am truly sorry for the way you were treated. You deserved far greater respect than you were shown." The 2 gentlemen beside him fell completely silent. Edward studied her for several long moments. Then the carefully controlled expression on his face shifted ever so slightly, like a door opening just enough to reveal that it was no longer firmly shut. "That," he said at last, "is unexpectedly honest." "I have always found honesty far more valuable than performance," Elizabeth answered. A faint smile touched her lips. "Although, at the moment, I seem to be the only person in this room who believes that." She paused before continuing. "There is something else you deserve to know. It concerns the Duke of Mercer's brother, what my sister has been telling people, and what truly happened." She spoke quietly and with deliberate precision, fully aware that the 2 unfamiliar gentlemen standing nearby had become unwilling witnesses to every word. Elizabeth explained that Cecily had invented the entire story about the young man's involvement. His name had been sacrificed as a convenient excuse, used to shield Cecily from scandal and preserve her standing in society. In truth, he had done nothing wrong. He had simply become an innocent scapegoat. As she spoke, Edward's jaw gradually tightened. When she finished, he asked quietly, "Your family knows all of this?" "Yes," Elizabeth replied. "And yet they sent you here tonight without asking you to tell the truth?" "They sent me here with instructions to say as little as possible and to avoid creating any further damage." She met his eyes without hesitation. "I decided that was the wrong course of action." Edward remained silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, the sincerity in his voice carried more weight than the words themselves. "Thank you, Miss Voss." Elizabeth gave a graceful curtsy before turning away. She walked straight into what would become the most difficult moment of the evening. Lady Hartwell had repositioned herself to the center of the ballroom. 4 of her closest companions stood around her like members of a royal court, leaving Elizabeth with no graceful path of escape. The musicians had paused between dances, and an unmistakable hush settled over the room. Everyone seemed to sense that something significant was about to unfold. Miss Voss. Lady Hartwell's voice was warm, polished, and deceptively pleasant, the voice of a woman who had mastered the art of delivering cruelty with elegance. "How very courageous of your family to send you. I assume your sister was unavailable." Carefully measured laughter spread through the room, refined by years of aristocratic etiquette, until it sounded almost indistinguishable from genuine amusement. "My sister sends her sincerest regrets, my lady," Elizabeth answered calmly. "Does she?" Lady Hartwell asked, tilting her head with practiced curiosity. "I must admit, I am unfamiliar with the sort of regret one offers after dragging a respectable family's name through every newspaper in London. Perhaps your family has developed its own unique vocabulary for such matters." The words landed exactly as intended. The room fell completely silent. Everyone waited. Elizabeth drew a breath and opened her mouth to respond. Before she could speak, however, a calm voice came from slightly behind her left shoulder. It was unhurried, steady, and carried the effortless authority of someone who never needed to raise his voice in order to command an entire room. "Lady Hartwell." The Duke of Mercer stepped effortlessly into the circle. He moved through the crowded ballroom with the quiet confidence of a man to whom every gathering instinctively made way, as though resistance simply did not exist in his world. Up close, Elizabeth realized he was even taller than he had appeared from across the room. His dark eyes were calm and unwavering, revealing nothing while missing nothing. "I believe we were promised a Scottish reel before supper," he said smoothly. "I have been searching for a partner composed enough to survive the first 3 figures without bringing the entire dance to ruin." Then he turned to Elizabeth with the easy familiarity of someone merely continuing a conversation that had already begun. "Miss Voss, may I have the honor?" Silence settled over the room. It lasted only a heartbeat, yet it was long enough for everyone present to understand exactly what had happened. Before the eyes of Lady Hartwell and the entire ballroom, the Duke of Mercer had publicly chosen Elizabeth Voss as his partner for the next dance. Elizabeth looked at the hand he offered. Then she placed hers in it. "You may," she answered, her voice perfectly steady. Relief washed over her as he immediately guided her away before Lady Hartwell could recover quickly enough to respond. They reached their places at the edge of the forming dance set. "You didn't have to do that," Elizabeth said quietly. "No," the Duke replied without hesitation. "I didn't." She looked at him. "It will cost you something." He gave the faintest hint of a smile. The things worth doing usually do. As they took their positions opposite one another and the musicians prepared to begin, he spoke again. "You told Ashby the truth about my brother." It was not a question. Elizabeth met his gaze. "You were close enough to hear?" "I was close enough from the moment you entered the room." A brief silence followed before he continued. "My father's reply to your father's letter arrived this morning. By then, I already knew what your family had done, and I knew precisely why they had sent you here tonight." His expression remained composed. "I expected a carefully rehearsed performance." For the first time that evening, his eyes revealed the slightest trace of genuine interest. "You were not at all what I expected, Miss Voss." At that moment, the first notes of the music drifted through the ballroom, and the dance began. The Scottish reel quickly separated them, sending Elizabeth down the line before bringing her back again. During those brief 12 beats, she tried to make sense of what had just happened. The Duke of Mercer had come to the ball, fully aware of everything. He knew exactly what Cecily had done to his family. He knew why Elizabeth had been sent there and what her family had expected of her. Yet, despite all of that, he had crossed a crowded ballroom and chosen to stand beside her. She could not fully understand his reasons. For the moment, she placed the mystery alongside the growing list of things about the evening that refused to make sense. When the dance reunited them, she asked softly, "How is your brother?" The Duke's expression barely changed, though she noticed the slight tightening of his jaw. "He is staying at our country estate," he replied. "London is not a place he wishes to be at present." After a brief silence, he added quietly, "He is only 23 years old, yet his name was dragged into a scandal in which he played no part." "I know," Elizabeth answered. "That is why I told Mr. Ashby the truth." For the first time that evening, he looked directly into her eyes. It was no longer the measured, observant glance he had given everyone else, but something far more thoughtful. "You realized," he said, "that telling Mr. Ashby the truth in public would only make your own position more difficult." "Yes. Your family will hear about it before morning." "I know." "Then why?" Elizabeth did not hesitate. "Because he is 23 years old, and he did nothing wrong. I'm tired of watching innocent people carry the blame for someone else's mistakes." The dance came to its graceful conclusion. The Duke escorted her back to the edge of the ballroom. Then, instead of taking his leave, he remained at her side. Elizabeth understood immediately that this meant far more than the dance itself. A dance could be dismissed as simple courtesy. Standing beside her afterward could not. It was a quiet but unmistakable declaration, one every experienced observer in the room could read without difficulty. She did not ask him to leave. She was exhausted, and there was something reassuring about his calm, unwavering presence. The evening had already demanded more courage from her than she had believed she possessed. The following morning, before breakfast, a letter from her mother arrived. It filled 4 closely written pages. Her name, Elizabeth, had been underlined twice at the top of the first page. The tone only grew harsher from there. She was instructed to send the Duke of Mercer a formal note of thanks, and nothing more. She was reminded to remember her place. She was warned not to imagine that a gentleman of the Duke's rank would ever pursue the second daughter of an earl, whose family had been touched by scandal, for any reason that could possibly benefit the daughter herself. Most forcefully of all, she was ordered to suppress, immediately and forever, the reckless impulse that had led her to ignore her mother's carefully prepared instructions and reveal the family's private knowledge to Edward Ashby in a room full of witnesses. Elizabeth read the letter only once. Then she folded it neatly and placed it on the writing desk. She never wrote the note of thanks her mother had demanded. Only then did she realize something had changed within her. She was no longer afraid of her mother's anger. She could not say exactly when that fear had disappeared. Yet, sitting in the pale morning light, with the letter lying before her, she felt nothing but a deep, weary sense of clarity. It was the feeling of someone who had carried a crushing burden for years and had, at last, found the strength to set it down. 4 days later, the Duke of Mercer paid a formal visit. He requested a private audience with her father. The 2 men remained in the study for nearly 50 minutes. When the Duke finally emerged, his face revealed nothing at all. Elizabeth was beginning to understand that, with him, such complete composure often concealed far more than it revealed. A short while later, her father found her in the sitting room. He wore the uneasy expression of a man confronting circumstances he had never expected to face. "Mercer has asked for permission to pay you formal calls," he said. Elizabeth quietly closed the book she had been reading. "What was your answer?" For several moments, her father said nothing. It was the silence of a man reluctantly calculating consequences he did not care to acknowledge. "I told him I needed time to consider the request," he replied at last. After another pause, he added, "He said he would return in 2 days." A faint, almost reluctant smile crossed Elizabeth's face. He didn't sound as though he believed the matter was open to negotiation. "No," her father admitted. "And is it?" He looked at her, not through her, not beyond her toward Cecily, not with the absent-minded kindness he had perfected over years of treating Elizabeth as the dependable daughter who required little attention. For the first time in years, he truly saw her. He studied the woman standing before him, not the quiet, sensible figure who blended into the background of the household, but an individual with convictions, courage, and a will entirely her own. The realization seemed to surprise him. At length, he let out a slow breath. "No," he said quietly, "I don't suppose it is." The following morning, he gave the Duke of Mercer his permission to call on Elizabeth formally. The Duke called twice that week. On both occasions, he greeted Elizabeth with the same quiet confidence, as though there had never been any question that he would return. What struck her most was that he never offered compliments. Instead, he made thoughtful observations, carefully chosen remarks that acknowledged her intelligence rather than her appearance. Every conversation left her with the unmistakable feeling that he regarded her as someone whose mind deserved to be taken seriously. During one visit, he asked for her opinion on the ongoing negotiations over Eastern trade. She answered honestly, expecting the familiar expression of polite surprise that so often crossed a gentleman's face when a woman spoke with genuine understanding of political affairs. It never came. Instead, he listened with complete attention, considering every point she made as though her thoughts carried exactly the same weight as his own. On another afternoon, he spoke of his estate in Shropshire. There was no trace of pride or self-importance in his voice. He described the land with the quiet affection of a man who loved it deeply, not because he possessed it, but because it had become part of who he was. Later, almost without warning, he made a dry remark about Lady Hartwell's newly published portrait in the society pages. Elizabeth laughed before she could stop herself. The Duke noticed. Rather than pretending not to, he allowed himself the smallest smile, one of unmistakable satisfaction at having drawn genuine laughter from her. Oddly enough, she found that far more unsettling than any practiced flattery could ever have been. The opposition arrived exactly as Elizabeth had expected. It came in the form of the Duchess of Mercer. For more than 30 years, the Duchess had protected her family's social standing through political upheavals, scandals, and shifting alliances. She possessed the strategic discipline of a seasoned commander and had no intention of watching her son become connected to a family whose name had recently become synonymous with public disgrace. She did not visit the Voss residence. Instead, she chose a far subtler battlefield. At an afternoon tea hosted by a mutual acquaintance, she arranged, almost effortlessly, to find herself seated beside Elizabeth. Years of experience in society had made such maneuvers second nature. With perfect grace, impeccable manners, and the calm confidence of a woman accustomed to having her wishes respected without question, the Duchess began to deliver her assessment. "You are a sensible young woman, Miss Voss," the Duchess of Mercer said, as she poured her tea with the effortless composure of someone who had never been kept waiting for anything in her life. "Surely you are sensible enough to understand that my son's association with your family's present circumstances would benefit neither him nor you. The kindest course for both of you is to let this matter end quietly." Elizabeth met the Duchess's gaze across the tea table. The older woman possessed the quiet authority of someone who had exercised influence for so many years that she no longer recognized it as power. It had simply become the natural rhythm of her existence. "With all due respect, Your Grace," Elizabeth replied evenly, "your son seems perfectly capable of deciding for himself what serves his interests." The Duchess's expression remained perfectly composed. Young women who rely on that argument often discover that it has its limits. And mothers who rely too heavily on their son's obedience, Elizabeth answered, choosing each word with deliberate care, sometimes discover the same. Silence settled between them. It was not an awkward silence, but the unmistakable pause of two determined women who had both realized that neither intended to retreat. The Duchess gently placed her teacup onto its saucer. Something in her expression shifted, not into warmth, but into recognition. "You are not what I expected either," she said. Elizabeth could not decide whether it was meant as praise or as a warning. In time, she realized it had been both. What Elizabeth had not anticipated was Cecily. She had expected resistance from her mother, reluctant compromise from her father, the judgment of society, and even the Duchess of Mercer's opposition. What she had failed to anticipate was that Cecily, observing events unfold from the comfort of home, would recognize that the greatest threat was not to Elizabeth, but to herself. And she acted accordingly. 3 weeks after the Hartwell ball, a new story began circulating through London's drawing rooms and morning visits. It spread with remarkable speed because it confirmed what many people already wanted to believe. According to the latest version of events, William Mercer, the Duke's younger brother, had never been an innocent bystander in Cecily's broken engagement. Instead, it was said that he had pursued Cecily with such unwelcome persist that remaining engaged to Edward Ashby had become impossible. Cecily, the story claimed, had ended the engagement only to protect herself. She was presented as the victim, never the architect. Elizabeth heard the rumor repeated by 3 different people in a single afternoon. By evening, she had traced it back to its source with little difficulty. Cecily had never been nearly as subtle as she imagined herself to be. Elizabeth spent one sleepless night considering what had happened. She understood exactly why her sister had invented the story. She also understood what it would cost William Mercer if the lie took root, and what it would cost her if she chose to oppose it. The following morning, she put on her coat and went to the one place she had never intended to visit. The Duke received her in his study. The moment she entered, he rose to greet her. He studied her face with the same calm attentiveness that characterized everything he did. He did not ask what was wrong. He simply waited. Elizabeth told him everything. She explained the new rumor, identified its source, and recounted the entire chain of events, including everything she believed her family had known from the beginning. This time, she shielded no one. For too many years, she had carried the burden of protecting other people's comfort. She had no intention of carrying it any longer. When she finished, silence filled the room. "You came here knowing this would make your own position even more difficult," the Duke said quietly. "Yes. Your family will never forgive you." "No," she replied, meeting his eyes without hesitation. "They won't." He stood motionless for a moment. Then he crossed to his desk. Without wasting another second, he sat down and wrote 2 letters with the swift, purposeful efficiency of a man who had already made his decision. He sealed both. One he handed to his footman with instructions too quiet for Elizabeth to hear. The second remained in his hand. "I am sending Edward Ashby a complete written account," he said. "My brother can confirm a great deal of what happened." He looked up. "Mr. Ashby has both the standing and the reason to end these rumors publicly. I believe he will." After a brief pause, he added, "William may endure some embarrassment, but his name will be cleared. That matters far more." Elizabeth nodded. The Duke set the second letter down. "I would like to speak with your father. You've already spoken to him. I would like to speak with him again." There was a quiet certainty in his voice that left little room for misunderstanding. Elizabeth held his gaze. Morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the study, stretching across the carpet between them. Outside, London continued, as it always had. The steady rhythm of horses' hooves against cobblestones, the distant cries of street vendors, the ordinary sounds of a city that never paused for private reckonings. "Your mother won't approve," Elizabeth said. "My mother," the Duke replied dryly, "has disapproved of a great many things that later proved entirely worthwhile." The faintest hint of a smile touched his face. "She also informed me last week that you were nothing like what she expected." He paused. "Coming from her, I consider that a significant endorsement." Elizabeth looked at the man before her, the man who had crossed an entire ballroom simply to stand beside her, who had remained there even when doing so carried a social cost, who had spoken difficult truths without ever using them as weapons, who was now moving decisively to protect his brother's reputation while looking at her as though she were the one fixed certainty in an uncertain world. "It is not entirely impossible," she said softly. "In case you were wondering." He understood her meaning at once. "I was," he admitted, "wondering." Within a week, Edward Ashby presented the Mercer family's full account to everyone whose opinion mattered. As it happened, he had spent 6 weeks quietly containing a great deal of anger, with very few opportunities to act upon it. Given the truth, and permission to use it, he wasted neither. The fabricated story unraveled exactly as poorly built lies always do. Once the first supporting piece gave way, the rest collapsed with astonishing speed, leaving almost nothing of the falsehood standing. Cecily offered no public response. Cecily never spoke publicly. Privately, however, Elizabeth received a single letter. It contained only 4 sentences, written in her sister's familiar hand. There was no apology. What it contained was, perhaps, even more painful, a sincere inability to understand why Elizabeth had chosen this path. "You had everything arranged so well," Cecily wrote, as though Elizabeth's entire life had existed solely to make everyone else's easier, and as though the only surprising thing was that she had finally stopped. Elizabeth folded the letter, without replying, and placed it in a drawer. Perhaps one day she would feel something more complicated than she did now. But not today. Today she felt only peace. The wedding took place in December. Society could not decide whether it was scandalously rushed or magnificently indifferent to convention. Elizabeth considered it neither. To her, it was simply the natural conclusion reached when 2 people finally stopped negotiating with their fears and began trusting what they already knew. The Duchess of Mercer sat in the front pew, dressed in deep burgundy silk. Her posture was flawless, her expression calm and dignified. She had not exactly withdrawn her objections. Instead, over the previous weeks, Elizabeth had watched those objections quietly transform into something else. The Duchess had stopped trying to persuade her to leave. She had begun asking questions instead, real questions. Questions about managing the Shropshire estate. Questions about Elizabeth's opinions on the Corn Laws. Questions about her plans for the East Garden, which the Duchess observed, with a dryness that bordered on affection, had been a complete disaster since 1809. It was not affection. Not yet. It was respect. Elizabeth suspected it would prove far more enduring. William Mercer sat beside his mother. At 23, he seemed noticeably lighter than before, no longer carrying the invisible weight that had burdened him for months. His reputation had been restored. The quiet relief showed itself in small ways, in the ease of his posture, in the absence of constant caution, and in the expression of a young man slowly realizing he was allowed to put down a burden that had never truly belonged to him. As Elizabeth walked past, William caught her eye and gave a slight nod. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried the unmistakable promise of gratitude that would never be forgotten. Cecily was not present. Their father had advised against it. For once, she had listened. Their mother sat several rows behind, weeping quietly. Whether those tears were born of happiness, regret, or the painful realization that she had underestimated her daughter for 25 years, only to watch that daughter step into a life greater than anything she herself had imagined, Elizabeth neither knew nor cared to discover. She reached the altar. The Duke turned toward her. His expression was the one she had come to know best, calm, unwavering, and beneath that composure, something deeply personal that needed no audience to give it meaning. It was the same unspoken certainty that had first taken shape on a November morning in his study, beside 2 sealed letters and a question neither of them had ever asked outright. "You look," he said softly, "like someone who has finally made up her mind." Elizabeth smiled. "I made up my mind in a carriage last October," she replied. "I was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up." The smile that spread across his face was genuine, rare, and entirely hers. For years, Elizabeth had stood in rooms where no one truly saw her. Now she understood exactly what it felt like to be seen. Not admired, not rescued, seen. And with the same quiet certainty that had carried her through lonely carriage rides, silent drawing rooms, borrowed gowns, and endless expectations, she knew one thing beyond doubt. She would never again spend her life being only the sensible daughter. Only the useful one. Only the woman who quietly accepted everyone else's burdens while asking for nothing in return. She was Elizabeth Voss. She had offered an apology that was never hers to make before a room full of people waiting for her to fail. She had done it on her own terms. She had once been the forgotten sister, the practical daughter, the convenient solution to everyone else's problems. Yet she had walked out of that ballroom on the arm of a duke, not because someone had rescued her, but because someone had finally looked at her and recognized exactly who she had always been. And perhaps that is the heart of the story. If you have ever been the sensible one, the dependable one, the person everyone overlooked while relying on you, remember this: being truly seen is not a matter of luck. Sometimes it begins the moment you refuse to look away from yourself.